morning,
think
Justin.
that I know all of you, but just in case I don't, my name is Justin Zelger. Was born and baptized here as a baby, and have
Really?
been
At
for
Bethany?
quite
You
some
really?
time.
At Bethany?
Yeah, in the
Wow.
pew. So I am happy to be here before you today. Just a little bit of background. I am a history teacher at Dallastown High School as well. I studied history with a minor in political science in college, and I especially concentrated on constitutional law. I really loved that, federal politics, that kind of stuff. So that's a little bit of why it is that I'm standing here before you today. So we're going to start. It's kind of going to be a two-phase teaching this morning. First and foremost is going to be the basics of American government. I'm assuming, yes, that you are a well-educated group here today, but we're also recording this, so for anyone that's not as familiar with how our government is structured and how it works, we're going to have a brief explanation of that, and please, if you have any questions at the conclusion of that portion, I'll be happy to address any of those things. I do also have some resources. I didn't print as many of those about the governmental aspects as I did the church aspects that we'll get to in the second half, but we're going to do some Bible exploration and see what we can and how it applies to our lives, politically speaking. So, to start, the basics of American government. We often use a variety of different terms when talking about government. And the first one that comes up constantly, and I hear everyone talking about all the time, is just the term politics. And I think politics has sort of become a bad word, you know, just meaning those people shouting at one another about all that stuff.
Well, isn't it what it is?
It sure has taken on that appearance at times. But just a little bit of background. When we are talking about politics here today, the way that I'm going to define that is the way it has been historically and traditionally defined. So I will both be doing some biblical Greek and some other Greek. I know Brian will be all right with that. But the term politics does, as with many things, derive from a Greek term. First and foremost, the beginning of it, the pol, is from polis. The polis refers to the city or city-state, really, in this case, you know, Athens and Sparta and all of those components of ancient Greece. And really, the suffix, the second half of the word, is that ikos, or ika. So politika, politikos. And really that refers to any matters pertaining to the root word. So any matters pertaining to the city-state, the governmental structure, the social structure as well. So really the way that I'm going to hopefully be able to use this term today when I'm talking about politics is talking about anything that relates to our common life within our geographically designated area. And we'll talk about the different geographic designations. But I think so often we think about it as just matters of government, just lawmaking, just taxation. But really it refers to anything about our common life. We are, of course, social beings. We were created as such. And so the way in which we relate to one another really is what we're talking about as politics. And so that, I think, is an important preface. Now, with the American government specifically, our government was established as what we refer to as a constitutional republic. I think so often you hear different terms thrown around, you know, a democracy, a republic, a federal government, all of those different terms, but a constitutional republic, as you can see on the papers and the screen, is one in which we, the citizenry, don't make the majority of the decisions. We elect representatives, and we are then their constituents. Those representatives make those decisions. Once they've become elected, they may or may not reflect the will of those who elected them. If they want to get re-elected, they typically do, but not always. The key aspect, though, is that we're not just any old republic, we are a constitutional republic. That means we are ultimately governed by a document, in this case, the United States Constitution. That is the supreme law of the land. It supersedes any other governmental action. Nothing can be in violation of the United States Constitution. So it does provide us with a form of government in which we have a bunch of important distinctions made. There are several portions to the United States Constitution, and again, I have a couple copies if any of you would like to take one with you later today. But those major divisions have powers that are either granted to them or withheld from them. So each level and geographic designation of our government has some things that it's allowed to do and other things that it's not allowed to do. Those powers are either clearly defined or left for future decision-making by those elected representatives in the Republican-style decision-making. So there have been changes through the years to the Constitution itself. That takes place through an amendment process. There are 27 amendments, but really the first 10 were all of one go, and then 17 since then. The divisions within the government have two primary sort of separations. We have geographic divisions that are laid out by the United States Constitution. The primary geographic separations within the Constitution are between federal and state, the whole country, and then each of the various states. And then states also divide themselves between state jurisdictions and local jurisdictions. So just as the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, nothing can be in violation of it, each of these has further limits on their power. So the national or federal government is able to make decisions that relate to all of the states. At this point there are 50, of course there have not always been, but all of those states and the territories. Again, currently 16. I have an asterisk there because there are some disputed ones, but we'll say 16. I like the bigger number. They are limited still, though, by the constraints of the Constitution. So they may not, even though they can make rules that supersede everything else below them, they may not supersede the Constitution. The state government is limited in that they can make decisions over their whole geographic area, the whole state of Pennsylvania, but it may not make laws that violate either federal decision-making, that national government decision-making, or the Constitution. So it's further limited. Likewise with local. Our local governments, whether it be the County of York, the Borough of Red Lion, school district entities, whatever it happens to be, local governments in their various formats, they have power over their geographic locations as long as they don't violate state or federal or constitutional policies. The other divisions within our government are based on purpose, essentially, what their role within the governmental system is. We've got a legislative branch at the federal and state level, and the local varies depending on jurisdiction, but they are responsible primarily for making laws. That is what it is to legislate. They have other, at the federal level especially, very important powers. They are actually the entity that has the power to declare war and to ratify treaties at the end of a war. They are the entity that regulates trade, both internationally and interstate trade. And they have the power of the purse. They are in charge of taxation and spending. The executive branch is primarily responsible for enforcing the laws of the land. There are many things that have grown up within especially the federal executive branch, i.e. the president and his appointees. That power has expanded since the writing of our Constitution through a number of major events primarily. One of the first major expansions of presidential power came very early on. The third president, Thomas Jefferson, with Louisiana Purchase, and then onward from there. We see Lincoln expand the power, we see Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, and so on and so forth, expansions of power of the executive over time. Finally, we do have the judicial branch of our government. Again, at the federal level, that's represented by the United States Supreme Court and all of the federal courts. They are responsible for interpreting the laws and applying them to individual cases. So we hear most notably about that typically with Supreme Court decisions that have legal implications, but ultimately their job is to say, is this other governmental action in most cases with the Supreme Court in violation of either previous federal laws that would override it or the United States Constitution. Of course, we also have criminal codes that need to be enforced and judged as well. So, those are the major divisions of the United States government. One thing just from our founding that was quite clear was that we are a very diverse nation. Geographically diverse, economically diverse, and of course from the human perspective, quite diverse. So the reason that we had such debate, discussion, heated debates even, at the Constitutional Convention was that there were many competing interests. And so from our very founding, the ability to compromise and find solutions that can work for such varying economies and geographies and peoples has really been a cornerstone of how we are able to function. You know, how do we make some Maine fishermen compromise with some, you know, South Carolina cotton farmers? To go back to our founding and their economic differences, those that are more trade-based versus those that are more self-sustaining. And that ability to compromise really was tried, that they attempted to make sure that that was baked in to our governmental structure, that nobody could really seize power unchecked. And so we will often talk about checks and balances within our government, both between the levels of government, between the various states, and between the branches of government. Ways of making sure that no one person, group, party, state can seize power and lord it over the others. Okay, so for us, the citizenry, there are lots of ways in which we can participate in our governmental system. The one that we tend to think of most is voting. And frankly, this is the easiest one. We take maybe an hour out of our day, we go in, we write a name or check a box or do something digital depending on your voting machines and systems, and we go home, get a sticker. It's nice, right?
I'm looking forward to this election.
Good.
Because I was registered in New Mexico,
Yes,
and I couldn't had difficulty getting out of that. But when I redid my license, no, I got a notice saying that yes, I have a card in my wallet. This is a registered voter now.
good, good.
So
So you'll be ready.
I know where to go to vote. So I'm really looking forward to
Very nice.
casting my ballot
Yes.
this year or next year.
Well, and we are somewhat fortunate living here where we do, that we have pretty easy access to voting. We've got so many different locations. They're relatively geographically centered in your areas in which you live. At least in my experience, voting, you know, here in town and now down close to Stewartstown, it's not typically too bad in terms of lines. You know, the people at the polling place have always been pleasant when I've been there, all of those things. There are challenges and difficulties in other situations and locations, especially more populated areas. You know, you have a lot more people trying to do it. It can take longer, it can be more difficult. But even with that, you'll see the rest of the list. I think voting's still going to be considered the easiest of our possible ways of participating.
This room is a polling station.
Yes. Yes.
They're dropping off the voting equipment on the 31st,
Gotcha.
so.
Very nice. Yes.
About 2 years ago, I went to voting by mail.
Yes.
I don't even have
Yes,
to drive.
thank you. Yeah, you don't even have to take that time out of your day.
Yeah.
Yes,
And I got time to think about it while
that's true. Yeah, you're not under as much pressure of
Yeah.
somebody
So,
else is waiting behind me and yeah.
yeah.
Good, good, yes. I think we would all agree that it would be more difficult than voting to run for office. Let alone the time investment, which would be much greater. But I personally would not want to withstand the personal attacks that come along with that today, and not just today, historically as well. You know, a lot of people think that the mudslinging that we experience in politics, especially national politics, is somewhat new. But one of my favorite historical examples, Grover Cleveland, who was a president in the late 1800s that, unless you're really a history nerd, you might not remember.
Right.
But his opponents were, you know, just vicious. He had a child out of wedlock in the late 1800s. And so they were, you know, advertising in the newspapers and in speeches saying, "Ma, Ma, where's my pa? Off to Washington." And just, you know, attacking him viciously. So while, I'll take a step back. While we will talk later about how Christians might interact in these sorts of areas, running for office clearly is more onerous on the individual. Next, we can communicate with our elected officials. This is something that I think many people just aren't aware of, the ease and access that we have. Elected officials are required to provide access to communicate with them in various ways, writing and calling and organizing meetings and all of those sorts of things with those elected officials. Just to explore the ease of access, I checked out my local representative's website For my geographic area, that's Lloyd Smucker currently. And he has locations on the website where you can submit a form right there. There's an email address, there's a phone number. Now, will you get instant response? Maybe, maybe not, it probably depends. But there is ease of access, and we can at least do our part and send it in that direction, whether or not it is reciprocated. We can petition the government or a governmental official. This is essentially a more formal type of communication. This right to petition is guaranteed by the Constitution. It may not be revoked in any way. And it allows us to formally, typically within a group, say, this is something that's important to us. This is an action we would like to see taken. This is an action we would like to see cease. Anything like that. There is, even at the federal level again, a website to try and organize various petitions that are ongoing and the amount of support that they have. Participating in public or private discourse. That just means talking. We do have the right to talk with one another about the matters that are important to us in our public life. Again, it might seem strange to put that in a way of participating in the government, but when we rethink politics and government beyond just the people shouting on TV and reevaluate it as a way of living life together, then this absolutely fits in there. We do have the right. We have guaranteed free speech that may not be punished by the government. Now, can you go to your employer and say whatever you want? No, it depends on your employer, I guess. But the government may not punish you for this. And so we may participate in that public or private discussion, discourse about matters that apply to us all. We can participate in lobbying or supporting political action committees. This is a financial participation, primarily, in today's American government. That could mean contributing towards various interest groups, and they then use those finances to fund campaigns and try to influence public officials. We can also do the old style of lobbying, which is so named because they would wait in the lobbies of Washington to try to catch their ear for a moment. But again, most lobbying today is done financially through supports for different groups. We can directly, not through a political action committee or other interest group, financially support candidates or, again, those PACs. We can also, of course, simply perform our duties as citizens. We can pay our taxes. We can serve in jury duty. We can obey our local and state laws. Those things are still ways of participating in the government. We, in essence, John Locke, a political philosopher, talks about the social contract theory. That we as citizens in a community, in a country, have a social contract with one another. That if we all agree we are going to operate based on the laws of the land, it will make that life better for everyone. When we start violating that social contract, things can become a bit messier. And Locke is certainly not the original discusser of that. But again, as far as American government is concerned, we'll leave it there with John Locke. So, I do have a few frequently asked questions that come up in conversation. People know I'm a history teacher, and so they ask me questions, family, friends, etc. And so I included a few of those frequently asked questions, and then I'll allow time if you do have any other questions. First and foremost, what is separation of church and state? Or what about separation of church and state is often the way that it's really phrased. Well, the way that our government actually establishes this right, and it is a right, it's part of the Bill of Rights, is twofold. There are two primary things in which we see a separation of church and state. The first is that the United States government is restricted in its actions relating to our religions, not just Christianity, but religions in general. The first is what's called the Free Exercise Clause, and this means that every citizen in the United States of America has the ability to exercise their own religion in their own way, and that the government of the United States may not restrict the exercise of our religious beliefs. Secondly, there is a clause known as the Establishment Clause. The Establishment Clause says that the United States government may not establish an official state religion. So they may not say that this is our governmental religion, it's the official one, it's the important one, however they would want to phrase that, even if they still allow free exercise. They still may not restrict or name an established government. So the actual phrasing in the First Amendment, as you can see, it's part of a long amendment guaranteeing a variety of rights, but the underlined portion, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So it's short and sweet to the point, but that is what we have interpreted as through the many, many years and court cases on this topic. Keep in mind the context, and context will be a theme biblically as well later today, but keep in mind the context of the framers of the Constitution. They were leaving England, who had an official state religion, the Church of England. Many of our founders were Christians. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. And so they did not want to see the government have the ability to punish, marginalize, or direct people's religious beliefs and practices. Next question relates to that very topic. Is the United States a Christian nation despite? Well, first of all, no, because of the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. We do not have an official state religion, i.e. Christianity at large or as a specific denomination. So based on the First Amendment, no. Not entirely, because many people will argue, well, okay, legally, not a Christian nation, but like, the founders were all Christians, right? No, the founders were not all Christians. Many, yes, were. Many claimed to be, but we would not, in exploring their writings, maybe agree with that, depending upon doctrine and different beliefs there. Many were what we would call theistic rationalists. They believed that there's a God, but ultimately humans are in charge of all this, and you know, God's just a long, long way away, doing whatever he wants to do, but we're the ones that are here, and that's all that matters. Some, again, yes, claimed Christianity, but did definitely non-Christian actions and writing. I think the most famous among them, and I'll admit I'm a Thomas Jefferson fan historically speaking, but not so much in terms of my Christian faith. Jefferson, I won't say rewrote, but edited the Bible. You can still purchase a Jefferson Bible. He basically took out anything miraculous. He was like, well, that's all hogwash. We'll just leave in the non-miraculous stuff. And that's an oversimplification. But clearly, you know, we don't want to leave out the miracles. And so that would certainly be an aspect as well. Finally, in one way, you could argue that we have been more of a Christian nation, and that's by demographics. Throughout our history, we have been majority Christian. In many cases, a vast majority, at least nominal Christian, and we won't delve into that topic too much. But recently, we have seen a trend that's often referred to as the rise of the nones, in that stated atheists or just no religious affiliation responses have been increasing, and Christian responses to surveys have been decreasing. So yes, historically and currently, we are demographically a Christian majority nation. But there's no guarantee that that will continue onward into the future. Hopefully, we're here as a church. We can stem that tide, but we don't know for sure at this point. Do you, at this point, have any questions? My last one is, should it stem our actions? Should we then stay out of politics based on those things? But that's what the rest of our discussion is about. So, any governmental questions?
Well, you mentioned about how they hassled that president that you talked about.
Grover Cleveland,
Yes. Well, I know a bit. You probably know this too.
Yes.
But which side is the donkey?
Democrat.
All right. When Jackson was running,
Yes.
his adversaries were calling him the jackass and so he took the donkey as his political symbol, and he won the election. So from that that's how the Republicans got the donkey as their symbol.
Yeah, and that carries forward then a very notable election, the election of 1912, which had the best third-party performance by Teddy Roosevelt's Bull Moose Party. They have the moose with Wilson riding on it. They have Teddy drawn as a bull moose, and then William Howard Taft, who was built like me, only bigger.
Yes.
He was illustrated as an elephant then, because he was a large man. But yeah, very nice.
So, Yes, one I've always wondered about, you said that the state can't enact something that is against federal law, and the feds can't do anything that's against the Constitution.
Right.
So when a state votes to like legalize marijuana, when federally they say marijuana is an illegal
Yeah.
drug, how does,
So there
How's that
is
work?
a nuance. The federal government is granted power over interstate trade, not intrastate trade within a state's boundaries. So I believe Colorado was the first state.
okay,
Yep.
But within the state of Colorado, the state has jurisdiction over the economy. Now, if any of those growers, distributors, whatever, tried to trade outside of the state boundaries of Colorado, they could be arrested and charged on federal charges. However, within the state of Colorado, they were limited, the federal government was limited in what they could do. They couldn't enforce an interstate trade law on a state matter. Yeah. Many states will reciprocate on issues like that. They haven't with that one. But for instance, I was married in Pennsylvania. My marriage certificate is reciprocated by all 50 states. They all will recognize that yes, me and my wife are married even if we move out of state. So most things are reciprocated state to state, even though they were state law matters. That one, gun permits, driver's licenses used to vary, but they don't as much anymore. But there are those that are not always reciprocated, and because then it would become a federal matter. Yeah. Yes.
When was the president first given the power of executive order to just sign away things on his first day in office, which?
So it
never
has
the other guy did?
existed for a very long time, and it is implied even constitutionally, but it has drastically increased since the year 2000. We can see numbers in like the 10, 15 executive orders in a term, a 4-year term, dating back decades and decades. But really, it's not until George W. Bush, President Obama, and onward that we've seen the numbers of executive orders increasing more and more. That has seemingly coincided with more of the congressional deadlock, that presidents are becoming more activist presidents, but we've seen other precedents back to FDR and Teddy Roosevelt and others who exercised more and more of that political power.
Is it an amendment to the Constitution, or? was it-
No, it would be a portion of the article detailing the presidency. Let me see if I can find the exact wording here.
I find it weird that you even know where to go to find the wording.
He's a history teacher, though.
he did specialize in constitutional law.
Specialized.
Who raised him?
What's really weird is his kid can do it too. No,
Yeah.
4-year-old, yeah.
the 4-year-old.
He's actually not far behind him. That's the truth.
Right. That's okay, I'm curious. if it was-
Yeah, I'll try and find it for you later, but yes, it is something that has existed for a long time, but it really wasn't overly utilized, other than more kind of like grease on the wheels, so to speak. Previously, it was used as something to help other things along, but it has definitely bloomed in terms of its usage in the last 20 years. Yes.
Historically, when did Congress basically start forfeiting the right to declare war?
So technically, they haven't.
I know technically.
Yeah, it was really, the Gulf War was the first, Gulf War under George H.W. Bush was the first. Well, even, I mean,
Vietnam.
Korea was
Yeah.
termed a police action because they were trying to avoid the phrasing of war. Vietnam's the first one where they used the phrase war. But Congress was always sort of in agreement, even though they didn't officially declare war. Really, the Cold War is probably the answer to your question as to why we weren't declaring war
You think-
explicitly.
Just a general question. You think it was political? In other words, if I vote to declare war, but my constituents,
Yes,
you know.
yes. My assessment would be yes.
Okay.
I'd probably have to research it more beyond that gut response, but that would be my gut instinct. Yeah. I would say that Congress gave support to Korea, Vietnam, the other
Well, they had
Cold War
to fund it.
actions. Yes, exactly, exactly. It's not until we get to the first Gulf War and then the more recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, where we see more congressional disapproval, even though the funding got through. But yeah, there's obviously, since Vietnam especially, been public disapproval. But yeah, so that's why I would say yes to your question. Thank you. Any others? Okay. Again, that was phase one of the talk. Next, we'll get into more of the biblical aspects. First of all, let me affirm before you that I am in fact a follower of Jesus Christ.
Are you now?
I know my audience, and so I know that is the case for you as well. And I just want us all to, just say a quick thank you to his mom, Mary Christ, and his dad, Joseph Christ, that they could be here, for him on earth. Oh, wait, I might have mixed that up. Of course, again, I know my audience. You know that Christ is not a name, but rather a title. And the title, Christos Mashiach, means anointed one. Now, who was anointed in Israel? We had the priests and we had the kings. I would argue that priests and kings are, in some ways, political roles based on how I define that. They have power within public matters, matters pertaining to the public life that we share together. And so, really, I am a follower of my king and ruler, Jesus. And that's where we want to really firmly establish this conversation from here onward. So, a little bit of context. Once again, I'm a history teacher, I like context. So, what was the political context that Jesus lived in? Well, it was a Roman-occupied territory that had regional vassal state control under the Judean kings. What we mean by that, and if you know your Middle Ages history, serfs and vassals and all that fun stuff, but the vassal state control means that ultimately Rome is in charge, right?
Yep.
Rome is the big power. They are the be-all end-all. They were, Rome as a body and the emperor of Rome at this point, they were the Constitution, to borrow from our system. They were the final word. Now with that said, they didn't have internet, FaceTime. They could not immediately communicate with the vast reaches of their empire. A lot of historians and anthropologists point out that there's one exception, most empires in world history were limited by how far you could ride on a horse in roughly a week or two. That if it got bigger than what you could ride on a horse in a week or two, you couldn't keep control of it anymore. And so Rome was limited in what they could actually do with the far-ranging aspects of their empire. The exception is the Mongols, by the way, but they're weird historically in a lot of different ways. They break all the rules of history. It's great. I love it. But that day-to-day administration of their empire in all of the far-reaching aspects was left up to local rulers. Now, in some cases, that was Roman generals who were stationed in places like Gaul and modern-day United Kingdom and things like that. But in some cases, it was left to local authorities. In this case, they allowed Judean kings to have control. In addition to the control, the lawmaking, the day-to-day administration, there is also then a funding aspect. The reason that Rome was conquering more and more is that they wanted more taxes coming inward, or at least one of the reasons. And so the local administrators were responsible for administering that taxation. There were local Jewish tax collectors that were reporting to both Roman and Judean officials, such as Matthew. Lastly, in terms of citizenship, the subjects of Rome that were not citizens were second class, and that's why I put citizens in quotes, because they weren't citizens at all, but they were definitely second class. And so they could be treated differently than a Roman citizen. We see this notably in Acts and in Paul's letters, that there is a difference between citizenship and non-citizenship. They could be beaten. Again, when Paul was beaten, he said, excuse me, citizen, you shouldn't be doing this. You can get in trouble right now, right? They could be impressed. Like, wow, man, look how great that guy is. No. Impressment was the forced labor, basically, short-term forced labor. We hear about this in the carrying of the pack. And then we are told, of course, don't just do what you're required to do, but go the second mile. We can get to that more later as well. And then lastly, there is a lack of judicial rights. They do not have the right to a fair and speedy trial or freedom from excessive punishments, cruel and unusual punishments. None of that existed as well. So it was a much more restrictive and controlled governmental life that they were living under. So there were lots of different Judean responses to this Roman rule. The one that admittedly I think I would be most prone to is the first that I have here, which is the separatists, such as the Essenes at Qumran, who we can thank for the Dead Sea Scrolls. They went off into the wilderness and they said, we're gonna just stay out of it all. You all figure your thing out. We know God's gonna come and make this right at some point, and we're gonna hang out over here until that happens. I often joke with my mom that were it not for my family, whom I love very much, I would have moved to a mountainside long ago and just been camping out there by myself.
Side note on that, ever since he was a little boy, we talked about owning a mountain together, and we were gonna name it Justin Land, and he would be the sovereign ruler, and the only person who could do anything that he didn't rule was Mom. We still dream about that, just so you know.
So definitely, again, my temptation would be towards, I don't want to get involved in this. And honestly, even in our modern political world, sometimes I find myself falling prey to that. Of like, man, this is messy, there are lots of people involved, they're all talking about different things, I'm just gonna step out for a minute. So that was one response. Next, we see people that were a bit more fight, if we're fight or flight here, and that is the resistors. Most notable among them probably are the zealots, who were preparing, in terms of training themselves, their bodies, and their groups, for eventual political violence against Rome. And even current, in some cases, political violence against Rome. Of course, their actions in large part have to do with the destruction of the temple then, because Rome doesn't take kindly to you trying to use violence against it. There were the compromisers, those who were like, hey, you know, we can still like do most of our religious stuff, but then also work with Rome and get some money in the process. Of course, the tax collectors that fall into that category, but even the leadership, Herod and his officials and all of those different groups that would fall into that category. So, that's all, right? Just those three. Well, along comes a fourth way, and that is the Jesus way. And that's what we're going to try to explore for a little bit now. We're going to look first at Jesus' actions, then at some of his major teachings, the greatest commandment, the Great Commission, and the Sermon on the Mount in portion. So, the Jesus way, what does it look like in action? If we look to Jesus, and we want to be disciples of him, and we want to be more and more like him, what does he do? Now, admittedly, he has a lot more power than us. We have power through the Holy Spirit. Admittedly, we can't be exactly like him, but we can still look at his actions. So, he did all of the following, and this is of course a partial list, but he healed a Roman, a centurion's servant that was in his household, and he did it at the request of that Roman centurion, right? Now, let's take back a step here. How were the Romans treating the Jews at this point? Obviously very, very poorly. So he is, in fact, not just saying, love your enemy, but he is healing his enemy's servant. Secondly, he healed a Syrophoenician woman's daughter. He is stepping outside of the ethnic separation at this point. He is looking towards a Gentile with love and healing. He brought the synagogue ruler, Jairus' daughter, back to life. Again, even his detractors within Judaism, he's still loving, he is still healing. He healed a Samaritan leper. The Samaritans were hated. You weren't supposed to go within, however, 20 feet to 50 feet, something like that, of a leper. Stay far away from them, it's contagious. You would be unclean. He healed a paralytic at the pool of Bethesda. Now this one I think a lot of times we just glance over like, oh yeah, cool paralytic, it's close to water, whatever. The pool of Bethesda is not just any portion of water. It was actually a pool that was dedicated to a Greek god, and I love this, that it was the Greek god of healing. That he was like, oh, okay, so you've been hanging out here for a while, you haven't been healed yet. This is a good spot. I just love it. I love it. I love it. Such, underlying component there. He healed those that were unclean. He healed on the Sabbath. He healed the high priest's servant Malchus after Peter cut his ear off. So the people arresting them, he's healing. And of course, he was a friend of all cross-sections of society. Tax collectors, prostitutes, blue-collar fishermen, white-collar teachers, zealots, sinners of all kinds. Everybody. He didn't care what your background was. He didn't care, to borrow from today, which way you voted. So, one more thing. He also paid his taxes. We have, of course, two accounts of this. Matthew 17 and, sorry, I lost it, and Matthew 22, in which, of course, he is paying his taxes. Now, he's also teaching through that process, but that is governmental involvement. Again, the ways in which we participate in our government are varied, and we certainly see it here as well. So, when we get to this point, Matthew 22, we have seen Jesus do a lot of things. But I would like to explore his teachings just a little bit as well. And this is the teaching, of course, known as the greatest commandment. And you can follow along on the screens or on your packets, but it says, "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" And he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment." Now, if we simply stop it there, religion sounds very personal, private. It's okay for just me and my house and that's it, right? It's just between me and God. But it doesn't stop there. It goes on and says, "The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang the law and the prophets." So again, let's go back to our definition of politics. Politics is not just shouting on TV. It's not just voting. It is our public life together. All of us, images of God, human beings, and how we relate with one another. And so this greatest commandment has to speak into the way in which we treat one another in politics. So just based on this, step one in thinking about if you are representing Jesus well in your politics in the way we've defined it. In your thoughts, in your words, in your actions, relating to politics, political action, political speech, are you loving God with all your heart and soul and strength? Loving God, of course, means understanding as best we can what he wants from us and for us. It means letting God shape us. It means trying to spend time with God biblically in prayer, through reading, through worshiping together. And of course, in doing that reading, we see in Romans 12:2, "Do not be conformed to this age, but be transformed by the renewing of the mind, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." So is God shaping us, or is it culture? Is it party? Is it other people around us? Secondly, in our thoughts, words, and actions relating to politics, are we loving our neighbor as ourselves? Now, this is purely rhetorical, but is calling your neighbor a nut job, deplorable, an idiot, or, to borrow from Jesus, raka, is that a loving action? And one further question, just to remind us, who is your neighbor? Everybody. Everybody. And not only that, but he says even more explicitly, love your enemy also. Your enemy is your neighbor. Right? So if we are to listen, right here, the greatest commandment, it has to affect us in how we relate to one another as well. Next, the Great Commission. Matthew 28:16-20. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but they doubted. And Jesus came to them and said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And remember, I am with you, always, to the end of the age." So as we consider this commission that we are given, I think it's important to think also about, in all things relating to politics, are we acting in ways that enable us to make disciples of all nations and peoples? Or are we acting in ways that push that down the hill, down the road? We'll worry about that later. Certainly, of course, we can make converts in big ways. We see this in the Bible with Acts, we see this historically, the Billy Graham Crusades, and lots of other big, massive conversions. But I would argue, and I'm willing to listen to counterpoints, but I would argue that discipleship happens more in smaller settings, in relationships, in how we interact with one another in our lives, in our churches, in our communities. And I can't credit this, I wish I could, I don't remember where I heard it, it might have been in a sermon, I don't know, but I have heard it said that the best way to have political action as a Christian is really to just do your part and make one more disciple of Jesus Christ. It might have been you, Brian, I'm not sure where I got that from, but.
I don't think I'm that smart.
All right, I apologize to whomever the credit deserves, but maybe,
Yeah,
maybe.
yeah.
But the idea that we will change the world, if that is our goal most, by just doing what we're asked to do for God. And so I really, really think that these two teachings especially can be very instructive to us. Again, when we remember that politics is not something else. It is all the ways in which we relate with people within our defined geographic and political areas. Now lastly, the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew chapters 5 to 7. We're not going to read it all. I have the Bible here if anybody wants to reference it. But I just had some questions based on the different sections of the Sermon on the Mount. First and foremost, and this goes very much with making disciples, are we salt and light? Are we losing our saltiness or covering up our light? Really, when we are acting with the world around us, how do we appear? And I hate to phrase it that way, I think that can be too shallow. We're not just worried about appearances, but are we pushing people away from God, or do we draw them towards it? Are we giving them the flavor and preservation that comes with salt? Are we giving them light to the way that we are trying to see? So what do those outside the church think when they look at me? Secondly, are we carrying the commandments of our God and our Lord internally as well as externally? Are we going through the motions, or are we allowing our hearts to be made flesh instead of stone? We, of course, can see this in many aspects within the Sermon on the Mount. When Jesus talks about murder, when he talks about adultery, when he talks about divorce, he talks about not just our actions, not just the fact that I'm not stabbing you, but also that I'm not hating you in my heart. So it's not just going through the motions, it's not just putting on a show, a face, a front, but it's allowing God to transform our hearts through the Holy Spirit. Are we loving our enemy? This is where that source comes from. No matter what our political enemy is, whether within our country, based on another party, or another pack, or another whatever, or outside of our country, are we loving them no matter what they think, no matter what they do, no matter what they say? Are we finding ways to love them and remember that they are made in the image of God? Are we caring for the poor? This is something that is explicitly stated, Old and New Testament, Gospels and Epistles, over and over and over again, that this is something that we must be doing as followers of God, and if we want to live in a life modeled after Jesus. What is our heart's intent in our political actions? Are we trying to appear important, powerful, or are we trying to love God? Are we trying to just impress my neighbor and say, hey, I'm doing great over here? Or are we trying to do what is pleasing to God? Are we anxious? Are we judging others? Are we considering our own faults as we go throughout our political life? Again, our common life together. I get anxious at times. I do. I worry about the state of our country, our state, our political groups and entities. I do. But we are reminded that we need to go to God with that anxiety, with that worry, and we need to let him take care of it. We need to lay it before him, borrow from Pastor Mark's recent sermon. Are we asking God through the Spirit for guidance and listening after we ask? Are we reading our Bible after we ask? Are we praying more after we ask? to try to discern that answer. And we'll talk more about discernment in just a little bit. So again, that's a lot of questions, but I really think that those questions can be helpful. When we are going through our lives this week, this month, this year, if we can stop and ask ourselves those questions, it might have an impact on our behaviors. Now, I think that I could absolutely stop the talk there, and I think that that makes the point. I think that going through the teachings and actions of Jesus is sufficient, but I'm going to do more because I want to, and it's fun.
Preach it. Teach it.
Other aspects from the Bible about our political world. We're going to step first into the Old Testament and look at the book of Daniel. So, a little bit of context here as well. It's a different historical context. It is not Roman occupation. It is not Roman rule. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, or as they're more commonly known, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are living in a world in which a monarchy, Babylon, has not only control over them, but has abducted them from their home and taken them into the heart of Babylon. In general, yes, there is a king, and yes, he has final say, but there are various governmental entities. In fact, these four men are learning to be a part of the functions of Babylon, to be influential within that political entity. So a couple of lessons from Daniel and the verses that go along with it. The first one, and I really think, speaking back to what I mentioned about the anxiety in the previous one, I think that this is an important one. No matter what happens to any nation, state, local government, political party, whatever, God is in control of the situation. In the third year, we're from Daniel 1:1, in the third year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave King Jehoiakim of Judah into his power, as well as some of the vessels of the house of God. So it would be very easy for the Jewish people who are here to think, oh, God lost control. The other gods are taking over now. Ours is weaker. He's not still in control of this situation. But they are, as we're told here in the book of Daniel, they are aware, or at least some of them are aware, that God is still in charge of it. God is still in control of it. It is not Marduk, it is not Baal that has taken power and control of the situation. It is the one and only high God that we love that is in charge of the situation still. So when our preferred party loses an election, I think it can be comforting to remember God is still in charge of this. When we are in international conflict of any sort, I think it can be comforting to remember God is still in charge of this. Secondly, beyond being comforted, we can learn from the story of the golden statue about another important lesson relating to the government. To read from Daniel 4:4-6, then the herald loudly proclaimed, nations and peoples of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will be immediately thrown into the blazing furnace.
Ouch.
That would not be pleasant. To be clear, this is idolatry. The fact that it's idolatry should be pretty evident. There's a golden statue, they're supposed to worship it. But what is the idolatry? Many times I think we view this as just a historical replica, a remnant from the past that doesn't speak into our world today. We don't have golden statues that we're worshiping at, right? But I really think that we need to look beyond this as just being, oh, I'm not worshiping Zeus, I'm fine. I'm not worshiping Marduk, like, it's good to go. I really want to point out what this represents, and what it represents is the power of the state. That's what's being worshipped. It doesn't tell us what the statue is of explicitly. Different theories on that. It could be of Marduk, it could be of Nebuchadnezzar himself. But what it represents is the power of the state. And so I think when we think about just the worship of other gods, we miss the worship of other idols. state power, national power, etc. So again, rhetorical, but are we worshiping Lady Liberty? Are we worshiping the heroes of the past like George Washington? Are we worshiping our political candidates or the power, what they can do for us? And of course, that is only in our own hearts as to whether we know we are doing that or not. But I think it's an important question to ask ourselves here today. Next, we will move out of Daniel and into Jeremiah. I think that this is probably a verse that you are well acquainted with. But Jeremiah 29:7 says, "But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf. For in its welfare you will find your welfare." Now, again, a little bit of context. This is part of a letter from Jeremiah to the exiles in Babylon. They had seen the violent fall of Jerusalem. They had seen the process by which they were conquered. And so we read this verse and I think we lose sight of what they really experienced. It's like, oh yeah, grow where you're planted kind of a thing, you know, a nice platitude. But it goes beyond that. And I just wanted to look briefly at a psalm as well of the lament over the destruction of Jerusalem to try and share the poetic sort of explanation of what was going on. So this is Psalm 137 verses 1 to 9. "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, and there we wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows, there we hung up our harps. From there our captors asked us for songs, and our tormentors asked for mirth, saying, 'Sing us one of the songs of Zion.' How could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth, if I do not remember you. If I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites the day of Jerusalem's fall, how they said, 'Tear it down to its foundations.' O daughter Babylon, you devastator, happy shall they be who pay you back what you have done to us. Happy shall they be who take your little ones and dash them against the rock."
Ow,
Yes.
brutal.
So Jeremiah is writing to the people who experienced this depth of despair, who experienced all of this, and he's saying, do what's good for Babylon? To people that are feeling that way. So again, I think it's so easy for us to not grasp the depth to which we should love our enemies, to not grasp the depth to which we should pray for those around us, the city that we are in exile, to do actions towards their benefit. So often we use fear of evil as an excuse for evil ourselves. There's a great Hemingway quote that I'm sure I'm going to butcher, but more or less a guy got into a bar fight, and he says, "Tonight I was against evil, and then I was evil. And I continued and continued and continued." And I think that that really is what we have to be on guard for. Is just my fear of the other, my hatred of the other, going to make me violate Jeremiah 29:7? Yes.
What's the Edomites?
Edomites.
Who are they?
They are a regional neighbor. I believe it's being used as, they either helped Babylon or they became Babylon. Can you help me with that one?
Celebrate.
They celebrated as Babylon,
They watched
so they were a
as
neighbor.
Jerusalem
Thank
fell.
you.
They're part of all the Hittites
Yeah.
that Israel was supposed to wipe out and didn't. And
They left him in the land when they ended.
they left them. So they were always fighting, taking cities, burning fields.
Thank you. Next up, in Amos, and apologies for the packets, you won't see the background. I didn't realize when I printed it that it just put the image over the front, but it is on the screen. So Amos sees beyond the seeming success of Israel. Again, his context is in a time in which Israel is doing relatively well. And what Amos says is, I despise your religious festivals. Your assemblies are a stench to me. Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Though you bring choice fellowship offerings, I will have no regard for them. Away from the noise of your songs, I will not listen to the music of your harps, but let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. So again, the context is a successful or jubilant Israel. They're singing, they have grain offerings, they have burnt offerings. They're living in a time of abundance. And God is saying to them through the prophet Amos that I'm not interested in that because you are not letting your justice and righteousness roll on. So I wanted to just camp out at those two terms for a moment. Justice comes from the word mishpat, and righteous from tzedakah. And in the Greek, righteousness is dikaisune, I'm sorry, my Greek is poor. But what you will find on your paper actually is all of the beginning of a very long list of Jesus talking about righteousness. Before we get there, I want to go back to Genesis. And this is the first use of mishpat and tzedakah, justice and righteousness together in the Bible. And it is the Lord considering not just is he going to wipe out Sodom, but should he tell Abraham about it? And so as we can see Genesis 18, 17 to 19, the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Seeing that Abraham shall become a great and mighty nation, and that all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. No, for I have chosen him that he may charge his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring about for Abraham what he has promised. So we talked about the repeated discussion of caring for the poor, what was mentioned in the Sermon on the Mount. Another area that is all throughout the Bible is justice and righteousness. Justice and righteousness. Justice and righteousness. And again, it's not just here in Amos, it's not just in Genesis. That's why I have all of those righteousness tags for you that Jesus uses repeatedly. We can see it in Matthew. We can see it repeatedly. Let it be so now, for thus it is fitting for us to fulfill all righteousness. Blessed are those who hunger for righteousness, hunger and thirst for righteousness. So again, this idea of how do we interact with the people around us, with the people that God has put before us? Are we treating them justly? Are we fighting for justice for those that don't have power themselves? Are we righteous? Are we in right relationship with those people that are around us? Do we have mishpat and tzedakah in our social and political lives? Moving into the New Testament, to Romans 13, 1-7. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Do you wish to have no fear of the authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive approval, for it is God's servant for your good. But if you do what is wrong, you should be afraid, for the authority does not bear the sword in vain. It is the servant of God to execute wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be subject not only because of wrath, but also because of conscience. For the same reason you also pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants, busy with this very thing. Pay to all what is due them. Taxes to whom taxes are due, revenue to whom revenue is due, respect to whom respect is due, honor to whom honor is due. So again, we are reminded that the way in which we are acting with our state, with our community, with the people around us, with our governmental authorities, reflects our belief in God, our confidence in God.
You're a Christian in
Yes.
Germany in 1939,
Yes.
and you have Hitler as your president or ruler.
Yes.
And he's going to use this to,
He did. Yes, he did use this.
but then,
Yes.
Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
right, yeah,
Exactly.
you go against,
Exactly.
but but,
I love where your head's at, and that is where I'm going to be in just a moment.
okay, sorry.
No, please, don't apologize. I love it. Let me just pick two of my favorite proverbs. Speak to a fool according to his folly. Next line, do not correct a fool or you will become one yourself. I'm paraphrasing. Back to back. Foolish person I should argue with, I shouldn't argue with. And so what we are, and I should be able to just jump right to it, what we are really called into is wisdom and discernment. We should not blindly do everything that's told to us. We should first and foremost put it before God. Is this ruling authority telling me to do something that I can do in good conscience, and he talks about conscience in there, in good conscience, based upon what I know of God through the Bible, through prayer, through my community of fellow believers. And so that wisdom and discernment is really where the rubber meets the road. And that's why the slide right before that, I just said, okay, a lot of Bible, cool, but how do I actually act now? You know, the famous question, how then shall I live? And so really that wisdom and discernment is the difficulty. It's not an easy question. You know, obviously in extreme cases like that, but even in benign ones. Should I support the law against vagrancy because there are homeless sleeping on the benches? There's not a specific verse that says, like, yeah, homeless people shouldn't be on benches. It requires us to know our Creator, to know what He has taught to us, to be in prayer and communication with other believers. So I fully support what you're saying. Yeah, that seemingly contradicts what Paul is telling us there, right? It seemingly says, hold on, my ruling authority, why can't I find it? My ruling authority it is definitely telling me to do evil. But I don't think that Paul would go that far. That's my interpretation and discernment from it, yes.
I've always narrowed in on the word do, what you're talking about,
Yes.
and to the discernment
Yes.
of, you know, to your point earlier, people just want to take it.
Right, right. They want to lift that
Yeah,
simple, short
and,
component.
and the key is, what is God telling me to
Yes, yes,
do? With all those other factors involved.
right. Yes, sir.
I love the fact that you brought Daniel up.
Mhm.
Because, I mean, Daniel was a full participant in the Persian government.
Right,
And he was an official
yeah,
he was on staff.
yeah,
And yet, when it came to, am I gonna bow to this statue or not? And he's like, nope. And he's like, I need my other brothers to pray with me and fast with me
yes,
to help me through this. You know,
Yeah.
I'm gonna be a full participant
mhm,
as much as I'm able, but
yes,
I'm not gonna do what violates God.
right, right, absolutely. Thank you. And to help us with that wisdom and discernment, which I claim no expertise in this area other than I try to turn to the Bible, but there are definitely some that can help us be inspired, help us think about this wisdom and discernment. So you can see in the packets, I do have 3 verses there for you, but they will be on the screen as well. Ephesians 5:6-10. Let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of these things the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience. Therefore, do not become partners with them. For at one time you were darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of the light, for the fruit of light is found in all the good and the right and the true. And try to discern what is pleasing to the Lord. Romans 12:2. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is the good and acceptable and perfect. James 3:13-18. Who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not wisdom that comes down from above, but it is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. So, actually, you mentioned Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I had originally, when I was first drafting this, had a section here of historical examples outside of the Bible demonstrating wisdom and discernment. And Bonhoeffer was one of my first ones that I mentioned, Martin Luther King Jr., a number of others. For the sake of time, which I'm already getting close to, I did forego that. But we can look to not only historical examples of wisdom and discernment, not only biblical examples of wisdom and discernment, but to the point of, especially James there, community examples of wisdom and discernment? Who in your family do you trust their wisdom and discernment? Who in your church do you trust their wisdom and discernment? And so we can visit the Bible. We can commune with God in prayer, and we can go to other godly people and have those interactions with them. Now, again, some rhetorical questions just for us to think about, because, again, I am by no means an expert in wisdom and discernment. But when sharing information, so speaking with other people, debating with other people, arguing even, yes, we can argue and still maintain all of this. Posting things on the internet, on Facebook, whatever. With these questions, are we being wise and discerning? So one thing that I think is helpful in how I think about communication in general is, how do I get the person that I'm speaking with, typing with, whatever it happens to be, to want to listen? To want to listen and hear what I have to say. If I start by saying, hey, idiot, here's what's up, yeah, their ears are probably closed at that point. If I simply demean them, if I talk down to them, if I am disrespectful to them, am I really communicating effectively? Sure, I might be saying it, but I don't think I'm communicating it. So in terms of outgoing information, I think we need wisdom and discernment as well. Secondly, does what I want to say or type glorify God? Does it love my enemy, my neighbor? And does it help to make disciples of all nations? So we're back to where we started with that. And so incoming information, I think we need to filter it through the Bible. I think we need to take it in prayer. Outgoing information, I think we need to remember what we have been taught by our Lord and Savior. So, to summarize, God is the sovereign of all of creation. Jesus is our King. He was enthroned on our behalf. And we need to remember that that is where ultimate authority lies. To borrow just a little bit from Roman times as an analogy, even the United States government is just a vassal state. The United States government can't do anything that God doesn't permit. You know, Jesus tells us well about the Roman government. Don't you think I could have legions of angels here right now? So none of it happens without God's permission, at least. The church can and should act kind of like an embassy. Okay? We hopefully are an embassy for the kingdom of God. We are helping to make connections with people outside of the kingdom of God. We are trying to make disciples of all nations. We are the ambassadors of the church and of the kingdom of God. And so, yes, we should seek the welfare of the United States of America, not in an unquestioning way, but in a thoughtful way. So, to revisit, I told you a bunch of ways for Americans to participate in government, but I've sort of reworded them all just a bit as ways of followers of King Jesus to participate in the government. So, voting, yes, still first, but voting after prayerfully considering the best information that we can find. That might take a little more effort. That might take a little bit of research on the front end. It might take checking out multiple perspectives and sources. But prayerfully considering the best information we can about the candidates and their platforms. We can run for office, but the ways that we act while running for office should reflect the teachings of Jesus. We can communicate with our public officials, but we should probably do so in a way that reflects our love of neighbor. We can petition the government, again, with those same considerations. We can participate in public discourse with kindness and humility, and try to communicate effectively, not just speak. We can lobby and support elected officials, yes, but again, we should consider our Bibles, we should consider our prayer, we should consider our time with others. We can do so financially, and we can, of course, perform all of our duties of a citizen, taxes, jury duty, etc., just as we see from Joseph, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Paul, Jesus, etc. We see them do various duties of citizenship. They do pay the taxes, they do participate in the government, but they do so filtered through, first and foremost, King Jesus, or Paul, the Lord above, for those in the Old Testament. With that said, I'm asking you to do more. And so I wanted to provide you for some resources. Before you leave, if any of you would like this file shared with you as well, so you can click the links that are links, please let me know. But they are typed out in their entirety in case you just want to type them in yourselves. The first resource that I would like to share with you is the Discipleship Tools page on our very own church website. It has a variety of resources that can help you as you try to have more wisdom and discernment. The next one, umcjustice.org, the United Methodist Church does provide resources that focus on specific issues within especially American politics, but global politics as well. You will notice I did not talk into specific political issues or topics or talk about specific candidates. First of all, I'm not allowed to do that because we are a church. Secondly, I don't think that's the point. I think the point is what I focused on. But I also printed a number of those, not all of them, but a bunch of them up here, things about multilateralism, Palestine, immigration, healthcare, etc. And there are plenty here. I printed 20 of each, so you all can take all of them if you want to. Next, there's a website called All Sides. It is not a religiously affiliated organization, but it is a resource to try to avoid political bias in our news. It will share multiple sources about the same topics. So for instance, this morning I was reading 3 different articles about the recent Speaker of the House nominations and votes, different perspectives on the same information. A conservative perspective, a liberal perspective, and more of a centrist perspective. That would help in our wisdom and discernment as well. Likewise, factcheck.org and PolitiFact, those are both entities, non-governmental organizations that are focused on doing what they say, looking for fact-checking, especially of speeches and claims made by politicians on both sides of the aisle. If reading is not your favorite when it comes to all of that, I also included some audio options. There are 3 podcasts that I listen to a bit, Truth Over Tribe, Holy Post, and Bulletin. They all talk about contemporary American political events from a Christian perspective in each of those cases. Again, I think they probably vary a little bit, liberal to conservative. There's some variance there. Honestly, I'd probably point them mostly as more centrist in nature. I've listened to Holy Post for the longest, thanks to Sally, who introduced me to it a while ago. But the other 2 I started listening to in preparation for this talk, and I would recommend them, at least as a source of information. The Truth Over Tribe assessment that I have underlined there is also something on their site that can help you if you're not sure. You know, what are my political leanings? How do I sort of skew in terms of my biases? That assessment is a really good tool. You answer some basic questions, and it'll give you a report at the end in which it says, okay, it looks like you are, you know, this kind of political participant and that kind of stuff. So that's kind of a nice tool as well. Biblical sourcing, and one last thing before I officially conclude, and then of course you're welcome to talk with me as much as you would like, but that is that we do have our upcoming community Thanksgiving dinner, and I wanted to be sure and mention that you could attend and help with, or help with. But we would love to have you here as part of that in one way or another. Thank you all very much.